As the world continues to fight climate change, more and more money is being invested in the transition to clean green energy. Led by solar, low-emission technologies now account for nearly 90% of power generation investment. However, it is important to remember that investment flows into renewable energy and its technical components are currently unevenly distributed worldwide. The course for the energy of the future is being set now. How can the whole world benefit?
Welcome back, everyone. And this is a spotlight session on investment in transformation. And spotlight means it's short. It is shorter than our longer panel discussions. So I am going to keep my own words to a minimum, and that includes the introduction of our outstanding panel. I just want to give you one number before we begin, because that little report talked about ever more money flowing into renewables. The fact is that that investment reached an all-time high last year of nearly $2 billion a day during the first half of 2023. That's investment in clean, green energy. Renewables are outperforming fossil fuels on their rate of return. And yet, we have this enormous gap between the funding that is flowing into developed markets and into the global south. And that's what we want to talk about. How do we de-risk power system investments in these economies and reduce the cost of capital? What financial instruments and policies can promote reliable investment in renewable energy development in the global south? We have a fantastic panel to talk about those issues, and I introduce them, starting here with His Excellency Nani Shulga. He is Mauritania's Minister of Petroleum, Mines and Energy, and he's also a professor of engineering. Seated next to him is Nicola Beer. She is Vice President of the European Investment Bank, one of the world's largest providers of climate finance, and she also has served in the European Parliament. We are also joined virtually, you see her there over on the screen, by Vera Songwe. She chairs the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility and co-chairs the high-level panel on climate finance Global Development Network, which supports oriented research in low and middle income countries. And she formerly served as United Nations Undersecretary General and was the first woman to lead the Economic Commission for Africa. And finally, Andrew Jeffries is with us. He works with the Asian Development Bank, overseeing its energy transition mechanism and all activities related to just energy transition partnerships across the South Asian region. Great to have you with us as well. Before we launch our discussion, let's do a really quick Slido question, if you don't mind, ladies and gentlemen. Please get out your mobile devices. Use our barcode to go online. And here's our question. Which aspect of financing the energy transition do you consider most important? Policy and regulatory frameworks, access to foreign direct investment, de-risking, just transition, innovation and technology development, energy efficiency and demand-side management, or building up local domestic investment and financing? And I know we all wish there was another answer, which would be all of the above, but we don't have that on our list, so please choose one of those. And while we're waiting for the result, I will go to Minister Shruga and ask you, given Mauritania's enormous potential for renewable energy, what are your main priorities, and to what degree does financing represent an obstacle?
Merci beaucoup. Et effectivement, le problème des financements.
Well, thank you so much. And financing is quite an issue, actually. And it's generally an issue, but for us in Africa in particular, I mean, we heard a couple of facts and figures this morning. 60% of the solar potential is on the African continent, but just 1% of solar energy generation actually happens on the African continent. And there are still 600 million people on the African continent that have no access to electricity. And the main issue, I think, is financing infrastructure. The costs are relatively high. They are so high that private investors are no longer able to have viable projects. Capital costs are too high. Add to that the issue of education, which means a lack of skilled workers, a lack of infrastructure. But I think the biggest issue is the access to finance, which leads to an increase in costs. Now, we are, of course, trying to remedy these issues, but it's not enough. We are seeing huge amounts of financing that is needed. Now, on top of that, we see a lack in infrastructure. Now, there are a lot of partners that already contributed to improving that situation. The World Bank is active in this area, and the European Union is active in this area as well, and helped us in that situation, and we actually made quite some progress. Now, still, the access to financing remains an issue for all countries on the African continent. Now, if we do not manage to create an access to financing in order to overcome these hurdles, and they're often geopolitical, international issues at play here. And if we do not overcome this, we won't be able to shape this energy transition successfully, and that is going to have further repercussions. Because how we generate electricity is still tied to using fossil fuels majorly, and we need the means to financing and access to financing that allows us to tap into these funds, and that also has to happen in a way that accelerates the entire process.
And particularly in regard to de-risking. But let me go now to Nicolas Beer, if I may. And last summer, the bank raised its stake in supporting clean power and energy security, and said it aims to mobilize over 150 billion euros in new green investments over the next 3 years. My question is simple: how?
Thank you first for having me, also for the question. I think it is coming also with a track record, because we cannot build up this just in the scratch, but you have to have a base. And the base is that the EIB decided in 2018 to change from a bank supporting climate action to a climate bank. And this comes with 3 commitments, from which we already fulfilled 2 out of the 3. The first is up from 2021 to align 100% with everything we are doing with the Paris Agreement. Then to have by 2025 the more than 50% of what we are doing investing in climate action, and this was already fulfilled 2 years earlier, so we are already up over the 50%, nearly 60 on average. And then the third goal, to have 1 trillion of investments supported, and there we are very good on track with nearly 400 billions already done. And this is then coming together when there is a need for really speeding up on some of the measures, as it was here, especially for the wind energy. And this came together with the wind package of European Union. And there we could speed up because there was revising of the regulation, so more flexibility. We could bundle also with national funds, which was very important. We were allowed for the first time to go up more than 50% of funding in one single project. So we can go up to 75% under this program. And what is also important, that we come together on a package so that we combine financial assistance also with advisory on technicalities, often on the ground. And this is very important to make projects mature for bankability, because at the end, we both are committed to make a project really bankable. We can mitigate risk in the first stages, especially when we blend financing also with grants from institutions as a European Union, from the European budget. But of course, at the end, we try to bring advisory on the ground to have a really successful project in infrastructure, in skilling up people, in how developing a whole region, in creating jobs, because this is where the project becomes attractive for private capital, and this will be important always to bring capital from private investors in, to crowd in, because the task is too huge. We cannot do it all by public money.
Thank you very much. And as I mentioned, we will come back to our poll result later on, and then we can talk perhaps a bit more about some of the issues that you just raised. Let me go over to Vera Songwe now, if I may, and talk a little bit about that enormous gap that we have mentioned several times at the BETD today. In your recent report on finance for climate action, you said that the failure by the developed countries, by the North, to deliver the climate finance commitment of 100 billion a year by 2020 has eroded trust. What is absolutely crucial to regaining trust? And do you think that the pledges that were made at COP28, especially in regard to finance, do they make a difference?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to join the BETD. And also a great pleasure to be here with this wonderful and amazing panel. Nice to see the minister. Listen, and you've spent the day already listening to a lot of numbers, but before I answer your question, let me just give you one more. You know, we are 40%, the developing world, emerging markets, and the developing economies are 40% of the global population, and they account only for 7% of clean energy spending in 2022. And only 12% of that is private finance. We know even on the sort of bond issuance side, you know, only 5% of sustainability-linked bonds go to emerging markets and developing economies. And so there is a huge need for financing. Financing is the big question. On the question of trust, I think, you know, where we want to go is really to say three things. You know, the SDRs were issued at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. The SDRs were used to shore up budgets, you know, strengthen currencies. The climate crisis is an enormous crisis. It's probably bigger than the COVID pandemic when you look at it in the scale and the effect and impact it's going to have on growth. So what we would like is issuance of SDRs and use of SDRs for climate. We have seen the African Development Bank, for example, ask for some SDRs with the leverage ratio of 1 to 4 if you were able to get those SDRs. It is all about investment and crowding in the private sector. Trust goes through, you know, the other side of trust is risk, right? If you don't trust, then risk is high. The minister talked about crowding in a lot of resources. The only way to crowd in more resources is to lower risk using concessional funding. IDA, the International Development Association, the World Bank's window for the poorest countries, is about to raise new funding. For many IDA countries, the only way that they can fight the climate challenge and get the 600 million people that today do not have access to energy is by having concessional financing. And so essentially, again, funding IDA for the last 10 years, this is the pool of resources we call the most important pool for the, you know, poorest countries. Contributions to the IDA pool has been going down for 10 years consistently. There's no way we can fight climate and not fund IDA in a way that allows them to use the IDA resources to leverage private sector funding. So again, I think that's another area. Loss and damage fund, and this is rebuilding trust. We saw that the loss and damage fund was created first in Egypt with the COP, and that's, I think, one of the big successes of the Egyptian COP. And in Dubai, we saw some funding to it. huge amounts of resources. The Altera Fund was launched in Dubai as well. I think today, again, it's how we translate, the big announcements into actually implementable projects on the ground. In your last session, you talked a little bit about greening some of the industries on the continent, green industrialization, a term that was used a lot in Dubai. It also needs funding. To fund, again, we need to de-risk. But part of de-risking is also working with the local environment. We have seen with Africa 50, and EIB has done a fantastic job as well. But with Africa 50 on the continent, working with local pension funds to crowd in domestic capital, which in itself comes in with a higher or lower degree of risk assessments and is willing to put local currency into these investments. Foreign exchange is a huge part of why projects are expensive on the continent. If we can use more local investment, use more local capital, local savings, domestic savings, I think we can do a little bit more. And that will build trust even in the local economies. And finally, I think it's the supply chain, the offtake. We need manufacturing and we need emerging market economies to be part of the manufacturing supply chain so that we can get a secure offtake and improve the cost of financing.
Vera Songwe, thank you very much for that. And stay with us, please, because we'll come back to you for some closing thoughts in just a moment. Let me go now to Andrew Jeffries. And Asia today has the most greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, and yet 150 million people there are still without access to electricity. So clearly accelerating the clean energy transition could achieve two goals at one time. Where do you see the main barriers there to scaling up renewables, and how are you working to mitigate them through financial measures and instruments?
Thank you for the question. I think several main barriers are just kind of overall macro level barriers. Some of these countries are growing at 6, 7, 8% per year. And because they're developing countries with the end users, the payers of the electricity tariffs have a fraction of the income of developed countries. And it's either the end users or taxpayers that are going to pay ultimately for a lot of the transition. So, but as the wealth grows, energy use grows significantly. And so the demand for electricity, the demand for energy is growing faster than their GDP rates. So you are in a situation where within 10 years, you need to double your energy supply infrastructure. As compared to a lot of developed countries with relatively flat demand growth, it just makes the challenge all that much more difficult, and the pressure just to keep the lights on year in, year out through massive levels of investment that much more intense. There's also, our institution has been deeply involved with trying to address early fossil fuel or coal-fired power retirement. The average age of coal fleets in the Southeast Asia, for example, is 15 years. So whereas the average age of such plants in, say, North America or Europe is 45 plus years. So these plants have not been depreciated yet. Investment returns haven't been earned yet. And that just kind of adds to the collective challenge.
Thank you very much. And what I would suggest now, I'm dying to ask you about how just energy transition partnerships can fit into that kind of a scheme, but let's do it in the context of the poll results since we have very little time left. Could we get the poll result up on the big screens? And dear audience, would you tell us when it's there? Great, okay. So if we look at what the audience said about what aspects they think are most important, we see far and away the largest share saying policy and regulatory frameworks, and 43%, 37% say it's all about de-risking. And then slightly lower shares, building up local domestic investment and financing, 24%, access to foreign direct investment, perhaps slightly surprisingly low at 18%, innovation and technology development, also 18%, and then just transition, 12%, energy efficient and demand side management, 10%. I'd like to ask all of you, because we really haven't much time left, to pick out one of those areas and tell us why you think that is so important and what that should look like concretely going forward for your country, for your organization, for your region in particular. And again, I'll start here, if I may, with Minister Schruger.
Merci. Et effectivement, ce problème se pose de politique.
Well, thank you so much. And you mentioned the conditions. Now, let me give you an example from Mauritania. We have 1.5 million square kilometers, along coast, on the Atlantic coast as well. So there is a huge potential for renewables, wind energy. We have a lot of high wind speeds. We have sun 365 days per year. And again, on the Atlantic coast, we have a long coast. So these are ideal conditions, a wealth of resources. And we have an opportunity here to be independent in producing our energy. And we've been working on green hydrogen for about a year now, and we've been working on the legal framework that is attractive to stakeholders. So we are sitting down with all the involved stakeholders. We have memorandums of understanding that are signed with international companies, BP and others, with CWP as well. So we want to expand our green hydrogen production with these partners. But the issue isn't really regulation. African countries already have made a lot of progress when it comes to incentivizing private investment. I think the main issue is access to financing, because all stakeholders that we've been in discussion with when it comes to expanding green hydrogen production, when it comes to creating tax incentives as well, and when it comes to providing attractive conditions for our partners, we have to solve the issue of access to financing. So the barriers are still too high. The European Union, I think, is working on this. They're working on maybe launching an investment bank just focused on green hydrogen. And we hope that the developed countries that are mainly responsible for CO2 emissions, that they manage to calm down investors and regain the trust that was lost, and make sure that they understand that it is worth investing in green hydrogen, especially in Mauritania. Another advantage in our country is that we have a lot of mining resources, iron ore in our country that we can tap into. So that, again, is a huge potential. So we can also produce green steel using green hydrogen at an incredible cost, because we have a huge potential for renewables, and we can export those resources to Europe. So I think it is important to look towards Mauritania for that kind of production and to also export that then to Europe.
Clearly an enormous amount of potential. The question is just how to get there. And we will, by the way, have a session tomorrow on green hydrogen and the essential standards and regulations that have to be put into place. So let me go over to Nicolas Baer also and ask you to do the same, to pick out whatever on that list strikes you as absolutely crucial and tell us why and share a concrete example, perhaps.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm not surprised by the outcome because I think the first two positions are really important. Now it changed a little bit, so the political and regulatory framework, a little bit less than the de-risking, but from our experience, this comes together with the third point then on coordination. And this is important because, of course, a stable framework, whether it is down on the ground of a project, whether it's also here in Europe, is something which gives security for investors, and it's about investment. So it's important to have this security. They have to have the chance to pay off. So there has to be a dividend at the end of those we try to crowd in. And this is only there when decisions are not changing every year, but you have a long-term investment in such infrastructures, in such huge projects. And this is important then that for the kickstart we can de-risk so that we can blend finance in that, because often there the investors are still reluctant, but with a stable framework we also create a certain kind of amount, and hydrogen was mentioned. Of course, with the regulatory framework for the Green Deal, the decarbonization of our industry, housings, mobility, there comes a demand for hydrogen. Now we have in the first beginnings we have to deal with the risk of volatility of the market price. This makes, for the moment, a project not really bankable because you cannot fix on a certain price to calculate also the risk and the price of the lending. But when we can blend it with grants, and this is also why Ursula von der Leyen, European ministers are also on trips abroad to build up relationships, to invest, so for a win-win partnership that we can get such green hydrogen also from countries like yours and others for decarbonization of our industry, housing and others. So this comes then with a win-win partnership, which is, I think, important because at the end, mitigating climate risk to do something for our world is a global problem, so cannot be solved in your country, in Europe, or in any other single country. We have to work globally, and this is what I need, or what I mentioned also for cooperation, really to cooperate global-wide.
And in that context, Amo.
Notre grand problème chez nous, c'est ce que les banquiers disent toujours, bancabilité.
Well, for us, you know, what the banks keep telling us is that it's difficult to provide the financing.
Trust, it was already mentioned, the trust that a project at the end is successful and I do not lose my money.
Je suis d'accord.
Je vais interromper. I want to go to Vera Songwe, but I'll ask her about bankability, okay? So, Vera Songwe, if I may come to you with two questions. First of all, the discussion about special drawing rights, the SDRs, has been around for some time now. Are you seeing any movement? Because clearly that is also a way that we could unlock capital for use in de-risking. So beyond that, second question, there's a plethora of financial initiatives springing up now. It seems that at every international meeting we go to, we hear about new finance transition accelerators and so on. Which of those do you consider most promising? What does an effective approach here look like?
Those are big questions, but two, I'm so glad you came back to the SDRs. I think, the IMF Articles of Agreement say that when we have a crisis, which is synchronized and systemic, so touching everybody, I mean, the climate crisis is touching, find somebody that it's not touching. And I think the last 2 years have shown us just how terrible it can be, from the United States to Canada to Pakistan, Italy, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Kenya, Ethiopia, go on and on. SDRs should be issued. SDRs were issued in 2008 for the financial crisis. It was mostly European, Greek. SDRs were issued for the COVID pandemic. We believe that the magnitude of climate change is one where we actually need very quickly to issue SDRs. But on top of that, we're also cognizant of the fact that many of the developed countries are also struggling because we have the inflation issues, we have interest rates that are rising, and so treasuries are stretched. And the only way then to be able to provide additional new capital, which is cheap, which is grant funding, everybody gets some of it, is through an issuance of SDRs. And maybe you take the top of the SDRs, 100 billion of those SDRs, put it in the developing institutions, the IMF, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, AIB, you split it up 40 billion each or 20 billion each, and they use those resources to leverage, de-risk, credit enhance private sector resources. So I think the crisis is urgent. You know, the Summers Singh report says the world is on fire. And so we need a big solution. We need it quickly. In this kind of fiscal environment, the best way to do that is to issue SDRs that maybe have, again, like I said, a component, 650 billion SDRs, of which 100 billion goes immediately into a climate fund. You know, in each of these institutions, the IMF already has the RST as a fund, and we can do more of those. So that's the SDR question. I think three things on the policy point. I just want to come back
briefly,
to
if you would, because we're running out of time.
Policy is important. But, you know, if you're in the developing economies today, financial regulation in the developed world says that if you invest in the emerging markets, it's more risky. So your credit coverage is 49%. So for the same energy project with the same returns, if you invest in Germany, your liquidity coverage is only 20%. If you invest in India or Mauritania, 49% liquidity coverage. So you're asking firms to use more liquidity, to tie up more liquidity just because they want to do an investment in India or in Mauritania, as opposed to doing it in Europe. So this is a policy point that we can change, and it's policy in the developed world. The other policy issue, which is policy in the developing world, is cost-effective prices. We must do cost-effective prices, but I must say that Mauritania is one of those countries that has been on the top of the Doing Business Index. They're doing well on many things, and I think that, you know, just hearing that they have difficulty crowding in capital is, you know, one of those things that begins to say, do we have some issues around the credit rating agencies as well? And can we do something different around policies on credit rating agencies that will encourage more investment? So policy, yes, but I think it's policies on both sides that need to be changed for us to be able to crowd in investment. And finally,
I'm just going to stop you there, I'm afraid, because we are running out of time. But thank you so much. Let me go over to Andrew Jeffries now for a quick last word. And if you could pick up just a little bit also on just energy transition.
I'll be brief, I promise. I'm going to cheat a little bit and combine a few of these. First of all, I totally agree. De-risking and the policy regulatory framework, they're directly linked. You know, the enabling environment creates lower risk, more certainty for investors. But I'm going to talk about the third one a little bit, the local investment and financing, because when you talk about de-risking for who? You know, it's pretty well known that you need, for someone to sink capital into a project for long-term, that they don't get their returns for many years, they need a degree of certainty. So take or pay contracts, power purchase agreements linked to hard currency. In the Asian region, it tends to be the US dollar. All these things de-risk a project, but that puts those risks directly onto the developing country and the utility, and often for political, they cannot pass through those costs via fluctuating tariffs. Again, the end users have much lower incomes, and it's political anywhere to raise electricity prices. I think that's magnified in a lot of these countries. So there's a lot of situations where you're throwing those risks onto a utility. They don't handle those risks very well, and it's created fundamental bottlenecks. So and a lot of these countries they're coming out of the pandemic with debt distress, and the numbers, the investment needs are just way too large for all foreign denominated, you know, hard currency lending and so forth. So I think more in the medium, longer term, I think it's critical that the domestic financing and the local currency financing become, you know, over time, take over the foreign.
Thank you very, very much. I hate to say it, but we have to leave it there. It's been a really interesting discussion with all four of you, and you've given us some very valuable messages to take with us. So let's give them a warm round of applause, please.